You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Today I have two guests here with me. One is Marc Hyden, political activist and amateur Roman historian. The other is Lawrence Reed, president of the Foundation for Economic Education, which you can find online at fee.org. Mark and Larry, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Garrett. Yes, thank you, Garrett.
Our topic today is an article that Mark and Larry co-authored on the slow-motion financial suicide of the Roman Empire. So let's start with a bit of background. If I'm in, say, the early days of the Roman Republic, what kind of economic environment would I expect?
Mark, do you want me to begin with that?
Please do.
Okay. Well, the Roman Republic began in the 6th century BC. And of course, at that time, all of Italy was really an agricultural society. It was not marked by urban centers until much later. So it was an agricultural society, relatively primitive compared to what would come within a few hundred years. But they did establish a republic with the division of power between two people at the very top, known as consuls. The Romans were very eager to avoid the concentration of power in the hands of a single man or a monarch. And so they split it between two consuls and gave them term limits. They could only serve in that position for a year, and the decisions of one could be vetoed by the other. And then they also created a Roman Senate, which represented largely noble families. But there were also popularly elected assemblies that many of the people of Rome, not by any means all, but many were eligible to cast ballots for. So it was an auspicious start, the first republic to that date that looked anything like the republics we're acquainted with in more recent times, but a primitive economy compared to what would come later.
Most people then were farmers.
Yes.
We'd recognize it as a fairly free market agrarian economy, more or less.
I would say definitely so. And if you look at what the Roman government did in its earliest form, it was very limited. It was there simply to protect you from invasion from other countries. And in fact, the early republic, they hated the idea of going to war, or at least they gave the pretenses of that. They didn't want to have any sort of conflicts unless it was absolutely just. And they thought that really the only role of government is to protect its citizens from some sort of incursions or invasions from other nations or tribes. Now that got perverted over the years, and they started looking for preemptive, supposedly, reasons to invade other countries and say that it was in self-defense, and it grew like that. But yeah, at the very earliest portions, I mean, the government was very limited. You didn't even really have much in the way of coinage. The earliest uses of the link coin, the denarius that they had in Rome, was really only to pay the army when it was necessary. But the army didn't even get paid, I believe, until maybe the 300s. So there was a few hundred years where they did it for free, just because they wanted to protect their families and they wanted to protect their crops.
Right. In those early days, the Roman army was a citizen army that when there was a crisis, they would take up arms, and then when the crisis ended, they'd go back to the fields. Am I correct about that?
Ideally, that's what they were supposed to do, and that is another part that ended up getting perverted because they pushed their borders further out, and they were invading other countries. It would take much longer. But yeah, it was a citizen militia, and it was supposed to be raised on an ad hoc basis and then disbanded shortly thereafter. But it didn't always turn out that way, especially in the later Republic.
So the first figure you mention in your article is someone named Licinius Stolo, a reformer. Can you tell me a little bit about him and what sort of context he comes on the scene?
I don't mind jumping in there, and I'm sure Larry can add a lot more to it. But he represented what and Larry talked about the form of government that Rome had, but he was what's called a tribune. And every year there were 10 tribunes who were elected, and they were a kind of a newer invention in the government. And they existed, in essence, to protect the proletariat, to protect the commoners from abuses from the elite, whether it's bills that may be harmful to them or in the court system as well. But these tribunes, they gathered so much power, and you can see it. If I could put a chart on all the vetoes and all the bills that they introduced, it would skyrocket because they became so powerful because they had veto powers. And it gets really confusing because the vetoes, the tribunes could veto other vetoes. So it was actually really confusing to try to figure out what's actually happening during some of these debates. But Licinius Stolo, he is kind of the progenitor of many of these radical tribunes that you see, and he brought out two measures. One was to issue essentially a moratorium on debt. This was in a period after Rome had been sacked by the Gauls, a large Gallic tribe that had invaded, and they were always at war with some of their neighbors there. So the crops were destroyed, and people kept borrowing money, and the lenders, understandably, wanted their money back. So there was this big crisis. So what Licinius Stolo did is say, if you pay back your bills in a few-year period, we're just going to say that you have to pay any interest for the next couple years. And that was one of his one of the things that he introduced. Now, in that same year, this was in 367 BC, he put a limit on what was known as the ager publicus. And what this was, it was public land that had essentially been taken from other states, other tribes by Rome, and they rented it out to people. So the state was actually making money this way. And this was this wasn't a very early invention. It was probably more in the Middle Republic, and then grew from there. And what happened was he believed that the rich were monopolizing the rental property. They were renting all of it, supposedly, and then farming it, and then taking all the profits. Well, Licinius Stolo thought, well, we need to have some poor people or less advantaged people to be able to take care or take advantage of the ager publicus. So he limited how much rich people could rent to 300 acres, hoping that some of the poor Romans could take advantage of it. And it didn't really turn out very well. And in fact, Licinius Stolo violated his own law by renting 600 acres, and then he got fined. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Licinius Stolo was all about. But I think Larry could probably add a little bit more.
Well, I would say that what Licinius was doing was one of the early examples of government going beyond its original charter and beginning to intervene in the economy to offer people things like debt forgiveness. And later, of course, in the late Republic, they offered Roman citizens a lot more than just things like debt forgiveness, also free grain and other staples of the Roman diet. So you see at the birth of the Roman Republic, considerable limitation on government, and with most Romans viewing government as a kind of peace keeper, both at home and keeping Rome safe from the potential of foreign invaders. But as the centuries wore on, people began to discover that the Roman government can do more than just protect the peace. It can also pass out goodies. And in the end, this is going to bankrupt Rome and pave the way for the tyranny of the empire.
So let me just go back to the form of the government. There were two consuls, and there was a senate which more or less represented the elites or the wealthy, and then there were these tribunes. And if I remember correctly, the tribune was not supposed to be a position that had a lot of power, but somehow the institution, the position grew to be much more powerful than it was originally intended. I'm trying to think of an analogy, maybe the Supreme Court in the United States. Can you tell me about how that transition happened?
Well, I think it's true of most positions in Rome that over time, more and more power was centralized. So whether it be the senators or even the tribunes in the popularly elected assemblies or the consuls who would morph ultimately into the later emperors. All through the 500 years roughly of the Roman Republic, you had a steady growth in the centralization of power in the hands of those leaders. And that's what ultimately, along with the fiscal insolvency, led to the breakdown of the freedoms of the Roman Republic and eventually the beginnings of the so-called empire, which probably most Americans would say they know more about that than they do the early Republic. But the empire was extraordinarily tyrannical in its latter years, but it was brought about by this fiscal insolvency and concentration of power that began partway through the Republic period.
Getting back to Stolo, he made this reform limiting the amount of land that could be rented to wealthy people, right? So from an economics perspective, we might say, well, maybe there are economies of scale with this land, and that's why people are renting it out in large portions. What kind of justification was given for this limitation?
Yeah, he limited it because he thought that the elite had actually monopolized the ager publicus, because there was these large, vast tracts of land. And what he saw from his vantage point, it was the ultra rich that was renting all of it. And to make it worse, he thought that they weren't actually paying their rent on time, and some of them didn't pay rent at all. So they were kind of just taking it from the government. And this is again from his point of view. So he saw that when the rich took over all of it, that the poor didn't have the opportunity to be able to rent it so they could better their own lives and they could support their own family, or they could pay their own bills and indeed taxes as well. So his introduction of this measure was supposedly as a means to help the poor landless Romans who he thought deserved to have a chance. But if you look at some of the studies that have been done on this measure, as well as some of the other land measures, you find that some of the lower classes, they didn't have the funds to be able to rent a large enough tract of land to be able to support their family. Because, a small farm, you need, 10, 15 acres. And that's just a small farm to help your family out. You need much more land than that. So I don't believe it actually helped the landless like he thought it was going to. And in fact, it might have hurt them, because some of these people actually worked on these farms that these rich nobles rented. These large tracts of land that they controlled, they actually hired people to help till the land. They also had slaves as well that were that worked the land, and oftentimes they were granted their freedom later on. So I believe that you'd find that, at least in certain cases, this may have had adverse effects.
It's what I mentioned before, the economies of scale, but also, there seemed to be some kind of corruption in how the land was distributed. Maybe if you knew the right people, you could get a great big tract of land and not have to pay for it.
Oh, corruption in ancient Rome was prevalent. Even in the early Republic, you start to see, or Middle Republic at least, you start to see it. But yeah, corruption got so bad that even you can look. One of the most egregious cases is probably Didius Julianus, the emperor who actually purchased the throne, the imperial throne. He bought it at an auction from the Praetorian Guard. So yes, even back in the Republic, this notion of bribery, it was widespread, and in fact, it was accepted and almost embraced.
So moving forward from Stolo, there's another reformer you mentioned, also a tribune named Tiberius Gracchus. He tried to reform the land in Rome. Can you tell me about him?
I think that's Larry's favorite guy, so I'll let him handle it.
It was Tiberius that also put in place Rome's first subsidized food program, which provided discounted grain to a lot of Roman citizens. And, you might say, I guess I would cut him some slack and say maybe he had the best of intentions. He undoubtedly saw that many times, especially when it came to land, that poor farmers had gotten the short end of the stick. Some of the big landowners were benefiting from connections to the Roman state, or the slaves that they brought home and then put to work in competition with the small farmers who didn't have slaves. But Tiberius really got the ball rolling when it came to reliance upon the government for one's livelihood, not only in the form of subsidized grain, but some land redistribution. And the clock was beginning to tick, you might say, surely by that point on Rome's Republic, because it's only a matter of time once this process begins, unless people come to their senses and say, hey, this is not a proper function of government. More and more groups will say, hey, why shouldn't I get something at other people's expense? So the Roman welfare state got a big jump start under Tiberius and just gathered steam in the decades to follow.
And I believe the Senate eventually murdered Tiberius. He didn't come to a very good end.
That's right. I believe it was it was senators. Is that correct, Mark?
That's right. I believe he was clubbed to death. But there's a lot more. I mean, Larry touched on some great points about Tiberius Gracchus, but really, this is the turning point in the Roman Republic. This is when things change. All of a sudden, it's okay to assassinate people that you don't like that are in public office. This is one of the first political assassinations in Roman history. I believe there may have been 3 before this, but it sped up after this, and it also sped up the welfare state. It sped up the spending, and a lot of things were put into play because of this. Now, his land bill that he had transferred, I believe, about 75,000 or so families, landless families, and I think he did it with a good heart. I really do. But I think what happened was obviously not in his plans. So a lot of this land in the Ager Publicus was rented by Rome's allies, the Italians. Well, he kicked the Italians off of their land that they believed was theirs to give to Romans. It didn't go to their allies. It only went to Roman citizens. And this really sparked some of the first discontent that led to a social war. In essence, a civil war that was devastating in Rome. But what happened to all this land is what I find so interesting. After they had this land and, these farms that were, multiple acres, they started lobbying representatives, their politicians in Rome, and said, we'd like to sell this back. We don't want to be farmers after all, which I understand. I wouldn't want to be a farmer either. But they sold it back thanklessly, the land that they got for free, and many of them just returned to Rome and got on the grain dole.
Right. So you took urban people who maybe didn't know a lot about farming, who already had a way of life, and you just said, okay, here's some land, be a farmer. It's no surprise that they would say, okay, that's great. Now I want to sell it. I really just want a lump sum of cash and to go back to whatever I did before.
Sure, and I think that they were put in a little bit of an unfair situation because you hit the nail on the head. They weren't taught how to be farmers. They were given farming tools, they were given a house, and they were given a land to build a farm on, but they just said, go make money, go make a living. And they didn't really show them how to do any of this. And it takes generations of families handing down knowledge to be a successful farmer, especially in that age.
Garrett, there's another interesting point that I'd like to make at this juncture in this article, which Mark and I wrote, which is available, by the way, at fee.org. If you just type in Rome or go to fee.org/Rome, you'll see that article plus other things. But there was a rich man in ancient Rome at this time named Piso who opposed this grain dole, this idea of the government giving out subsidized grain. But he was spotted waiting for the grain and was asked, I thought you were against this. And he said, well, hey, if my wealth is going to be redistributed, then I'm going to try to get my share of it. And that was a big problem with a lot of people who might have opposed this sort of thing. But once it started, it was like, hey, why be a fool and sit back and just pay for it? I might as well try to get some of it myself. And that's one of the eternal problems of every welfare state. It's so hard to limit because sooner or later, everybody wants to get in line and get something at other people's expense.
Of the changes that happen in these sort of waning days of the Republic, they introduce essentially state welfare or being able to redistribute through the state, which of course introduces the possibility that people will try to by popularity, political popularity. And they kill Tiberius Gracchus, which opens the sort of Pandora's box of just murdering your political enemies, and getting away with it. This is somewhat before they reform the military, but there's someone called Marius who introduces the Marian reforms, and I believe that's the point when Rome goes from having a citizen army to more of a professional army. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I know a little bit about Marius. That actually, there's a lot of misconceptions about what he actually did and what reforms he implemented. So each army was raised, like I said, ad hoc, and then the general, whoever the commanding general was, the consul or the proconsul at the time, usually implemented whatever reforms he wanted. They followed a rough standard, but there was no requirement to keep a standard. So the reforms that he implemented had actually been tested out, many of them at least, tested out by previous generals, and he just took the best of all of them and put them together in his armies, and he was wildly successful in the wars against Jugurtha and the wars against the Cimbric tribe, and some of the other conflicts that he entered in, as well as in the social war. But that didn't mean that these reforms were going to be handed down to his successors, and indeed some of them weren't. So the notion of a professional army actually doesn't come about until the Principate, with the Imperial Rome, once that comes about. Now, there were long campaigns before the empire, reared its ugly head, and these campaigns could keep you in the military for years. A maximum of 16 campaigns, or 16 years was the max. So that may give the appearance of a professional, permanent, standing army, but there really was no such thing at that time.
But the issue is that you had these armies that were, instead of being loyal to Rome or the sort of abstract nation state, they became loyal to the generals themselves, which gave those generals tremendous power.
That's right. And Julius Caesar is a perfect example of that in the 1st century BC. And by the time he comes to power, this business of being loyal to the guy who, gets you what you want, or treats you well, or commands your regiment, is pretty common in Rome, and that's a huge departure from the first 3 or more centuries of the Roman Republic.
And Garrett, there's another point that I can make off of that, including Marius, is, we've talked about these land bills that were introduced by different radical tribunes that gave land to Roman citizens. Well, the first land bill that I can see in my research that gave land specifically just to veterans was in 103 BC, and that was actually for Marius's veterans, where he settled many of them in Africa, which obviously won their support for the rest of his life, but it also planted them in areas that he thought might be warlike or be difficult to hold on to. But it wasn't long after that he wanted to do the same thing for his veterans from the Cimbric Wars, so he passed it in 100 BC. Although they used violence and a bunch of terrible things to pass it, so it was annulled. But this becomes a regular thing. Sulla in the 80s settled his troops. Pompey did it in 59 BC. Caesar did it in the 40s, and then it becomes almost a rite of passage. Once you retire from the army, they demanded these huge tracts of land, and if you didn't provide that, you better provide at least 10 years worth of gold. So there was this huge entitlement program and retirement benefits that became involved in this. And of course, you're right. The army is going to be loyal to whoever gives them the biggest treasure trove.
And with Caesar, you have the transition from a republic to an empire. Well, actually with Augustus, but Caesar gets the ball rolling. And he does it with this sort of centralization of power and with a single popular general / strongman.
That's true, and but don't forget, at the same time, you still had some very influential and very brave people like Cicero, who were speaking out on behalf of the old republic, trying to stave off the coming of these strong men who would crush Roman liberty. Cicero, of course, was eventually assassinated, and different historians will disagree as to, if you had to put one date on it, when would you say the end of the Republic was? I personally like to say it probably ended with Cicero's death in 43 BC, because when Mark Antony, who succeeded Julius Caesar, had Cicero assassinated, that was pretty much the last major voice out there speaking on behalf of restoring the old Republic. And not long thereafter, of course, then you get the first emperor, Augustus.
Yeah, that's right. And Larry, you make a lot of great points. And it's interesting to see the way the Roman people reacted, because they had lost their republic. They had lost their freedom. They had lost their voice. They had lost, as Larry has said numerous times, their character, which I couldn't agree with him more on that statement. But they had opportunities to get it back, but they didn't. They were happy. It got so bad that about 1/3 of Rome was receiving not subsidized grain, but completely free grain. And they added pork to that. They added salt, wine, olive oil, many other things. And one of the another turning point in Roman history is I can point to when Caligula was assassinated. The Senate got together and they said, this is great. Maybe we can have a republic again and we can start treating our people better. But the proletariat, the commons, they didn't want that. They were happy to yield their rights and their liberties in order for safety and for free grain.
One sort of thing that comes up again and again with these strongmen is that they really make a big show of being populist, I guess is the word, but of the people, for the people. They sort of, at least in the early days, seem to position themselves as, I represent you, the common people, and I'm going to take power from, the corrupt oligarchy that is the Senate. And, they sort of almost sell it like it's not me taking power. It's you, the people, taking power through me. Is that accurate?
Oh, I think so. Go ahead, Mark.
I agree, and I'm sure Larry was just going to echo what I said or was going to say. You see that today, and you saw that back then. Now, oftentimes they did change it a little bit, and they said that I'm doing all this for you. This is what you deserve. You deserve free grain. You deserve free land. We're in a country that has boundless wealth, and you should have this. It shouldn't be the corrupt elite. And believe you me, Garrett, the elite was very corrupt. So some of these criticisms were very well founded, but it evolved to where after they had bought the allegiance of many of these commons, they wanted to solidify their own power. So they would look for an opportunity to say, I've been wrong. So you can see Sulla did this. So did Caesar. They said, I've been wrong. So now that I've got you on my side, I want you to defend my dignity. And to do that, we have to invade Rome and pretty much conquer the city that made us. And there was a huge turning point when these strong men started to do that.
To paraphrase something that you hear a lot these days, and I'm not going to mention any particular names, but I'm sure there were some of these demagogues in ancient Rome who were saying to the people, support me and I'm going to make Rome great again. But I have a quote here from a historian by the name of H.J. Haskell, who looks at this tragic turn of events, the fall of the Republic and the coming of the Empire. He notes, quote, less than a century after the Republic had faded into the autocracy of the Empire, the people lost all taste for democratic institutions. On the death of an emperor, the Senate debated the question of restoring the Republic, but the commons preferred the rule of an extravagant despot who would continue the dole and furnish them free shows. The mob outside clamored for one ruler of the world. So that's full of lessons for today, isn't it?
Yeah. At least for a while, the empire, they no longer had their political freedom. They were a dictatorship, but you have the so-called 5 good emperors. At least for a while, there was, this expanding nation, and there was still commerce, and there was still a lot of economic activity going on, at least until the crisis of the 3rd century. So would you like to talk about maybe what led up to the sort of economic collapse that would happen later on.
Well, you're right. It wasn't a straight path. There were periods where they had decent emperors, and then they'd have a spell where there'd be several, like Tiberius and Caligula and Nero, who were just awful and brutal in their persecutions of people. But then you had Marcus Aurelius, who, as emperors go, was probably one of the better ones in the 3rd century. But what you had beneath it all was this continuing concentration of power. And every welfare warfare state produces this kind of thing. The power flows to the center, and then you've got this massive redistributive apparatus where the state is determining the livelihoods of so many people. And so everybody's either trying to get control of it so they can get more for themselves, or they're trying to get control of it so they can keep it off their back. It politicizes life heavily. And instead of taking time to produce and create wealth, people in an advanced welfare warfare state waste their time trying to get political power. And that just sucks the life out of any society.
I always remember Aurelius as being the old emperor who dies at the start of the movie Gladiator.
Yeah.
And he tells Russell Crowe that Commodus is not a moral man, referring to his son and heir. Commodus is the sort of the reign of Commodus is the point where things sort of break down and you get to a place where emperors have a very short life expectancy and there's constant fighting for political power. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There's a lot of truth in that, but we've been told about the reign of the 5 emperors, but there's actually another reign of several emperors that were supposedly really good too. But it depends how you define good. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, he was in a very tumultuous period. He was rarely in Rome because he was constantly fighting on the borders. So what happened in, the 100s is you start to see these Germanic and other barbarian tribes that are starting to unify, and they're getting very large, and they start seeing Rome with all this money, all this cool stuff, and they say, well, I'd like to have some of it. So you have more barbarian incursions that are happening, especially in Marcus Aurelius' reign. You can see there's a large turning point around that period. And also Marcus Aurelius, his monetary policy was actually pretty terrible. He lessened the silver rate or percentage in the denarius down to 80% when it was 150 or so years earlier that Augustus set it at 98%. So even though Marcus Aurelius is looked at as this great philosopher emperor, and he was very, very good, especially in comparison to some of these other emperors, he had his own faults, but he was also in a period where Rome was not only changing, but the world around Rome was changing. And when those two converge, it spells doom for Rome. But the one thing about the empire is the people were that they wanted to hold on to it, and they were still very powerful. So their fall took, about another 300 years.
So I'm glad you mentioned the debasing of the currency. So for context, we should probably talk about just how that was done. I mean, in the modern day, if the government wants to inflate, then the central bank uses open market operations, and this is not like that. Rather, they have metal currency, and they take in all the coins as taxes, and then they melt them down and then reform them with less silver content or gold, but in this case silver, and then circulate them around. And at least initially, people might be fooled and take the new coins as if they were the old coins, but they can't be fooled for very long, and sooner or later they figure out, sooner or later the prices adjust, whether because people figure out there's not so much precious metal in those coins, or just because there's more money chasing fewer goods.
That's right. That really began under Emperor Nero in the middle part of the 1st century AD, but it gathered steam thereafter. At the time of Nero, the denarius in Rome was well over 90% silver, but within a couple hundred years or so, it had fallen to less than 1% silver. The rest was all junk metals, And this was the way the Roman government inflated. And because it got to spend the cheaper money first, it tended to benefit from it, but at the expense of other people who got the new money last after its value had plummeted.
And I wanted to hop in there and say that markets aren't stupid, and it did not take long for Romans to figure out that they had been duped and they had been given this currency that's worth much less than before. But monetary science wasn't really had caught up, at least where we're at now. So oftentimes the emperors had no idea why things were spiraling out of control. So they would just say, well, let's print more money or mint more money, as a matter of fact, and things would just get worse. And this was a process that went for hundreds of years. And you had long depressions. You had money that became so worthless that soldiers wouldn't even accept it as payment, and the state wouldn't even accept their own money as taxes. So, they were minting it, and I really can't tell you why. Because it was utterly worthless. The silver percentage got so small that it was just a little silver wash on the outside of probably a bronze coin that you could rub off with your finger. So it became an utterly valueless piece of currency.
There's a great book written some years ago by a historian by the name of Max Shapiro. It's entitled The Penniless Billionaires. And he has basically 4 chapters in it, each one dealing with a hyperinflation in history. And the very first chapter deals with the Roman hyperinflation, the result of all of this debasement of the currency. Prices rose by the twinkling of an eye. He spoke of a cyclonic superinflation in the 4th century AD. And then with prices going through the roof, you have the coming of Emperor Diocletian, who in the year 301 AD decides to fight the inflation not by stopping the debasement of the currency so much, but rather by imposing comprehensive wage and price controls under penalty of death for violating them. And so what was left of the Roman economy at that point was pretty much shattered by the imposition of these controls that were on the books for about a dozen years.
He did many other very terrible things. As Larry said, he controlled the economy and he took over. And it's under Diocletian that the Principate, what Augustus started, turned into what's called the Dominate. And it becomes this authoritarian government where, anything that you could say was Roman, any sort of freedoms or liberties normally associated even with the imperial Rome vanished. He would tie people to land. They weren't allowed to leave land. They had to farm that land and they had to pay taxes on that. And essentially people were becoming slaves to the state, and he controlled these prices, which obviously some of these prices were so terrible that merchants refused to sell their goods, because if they sold it for another price, they could be put to death. So instead of being losing money or being put to death, they just stopped selling things. But there's an interesting correlation to the Republic that's fairly similar, and that's when they decided to tinker with interest rates because they were worried about these burdensome loans that people were taking out. And at first they tried to set it at 8%, and they saw the economy still wasn't working properly, so they put it at 4%. Well, they noticed 5 years later the economy was still in the shambles, so they said, let's abolish the interest rate. And, Garrett, this probably doesn't surprise you, and I know it doesn't surprise Larry. People stopped loaning money to anyone because there was no incentive to do it. So when the government got involved and made these reforms under Diocletian or in the 300s BC using interest rates, it backfired, and it was a terrible experiment.
Right. So there were price controls on grain and necessities, and then also on interest. What I've heard about the price controls on grain is that they were essentially non-binding in the places that grew a lot, like Egypt. But then the farther you got from those regions, the more effective they became. Of course, from Econ 101, if you have a price ceiling and it's set above the price set by supply and demand, it doesn't do anything. But then the farther below that equilibrium price you set it, the more damaging it becomes.
There were a lot of people who were put to death in violation of Diocletian's price controls. I have in front of me a quote from a contemporary Roman historian by the name of Lactantius. And in 314 AD, this would be 13 years after Diocletian imposed those controls, Lactantius wrote, after the many oppressions which he put in practice had brought a general shortage upon the empire, he then set himself to regulate the prices of all vendible things. There was much bloodshed upon very slight and trifling accounts, and the people brought provisions no more to markets, since they could not get a reasonable price for them. And this increased the shortage so much that at last, after many had died by it, the law itself was laid aside.
So at least they had the sense to do that, eventually repeal it.
Yeah, but at that point, the damage to the Roman economy was pretty extensive and largely permanent.
Now, those price controls, Garrett, that you're talking about, I've read a little bit about them, and they're usually having to do with what you're mentioning is in the Republic, where the government would actually buy the grain and then sell it for a discounted price, and hoping that would, I guess, influence the grain prices elsewhere. But under Diocletian, this was empire-wide. This is how much you're allowed to spend on X, and it was across the empire. Now, people tried to get around it, and as Larry pointed out, a lot of people didn't do it properly. So there's a little bit of a difference with the price controls in the Republic as opposed to the later empire.
Tell me a little bit about how the hyperinflation was resolved. The way I've read it, eventually they ended up with sort of a two-tier monetary system with gold being paid out to the military and taken in as taxes, but then a essentially worthless hyperinflated token money for the regular people. When does that situation come about?
That started, I believe, towards the end of Diocletian's reign, and he actually gave up the being emperor. He's the one of only two emperors that surrendered it, and it was a terrible decision on his part because the rest of his life was terrible. But that was carried on into the reign of Constantine, and Larry's going to be able to talk to this too. They tried to bring in a gold standard as opposed to a silver standard because the denarius had just morphed into this terrible thing that wasn't working. But the gold standard didn't really work that well either. They didn't have enough gold to actually cover all the money that they supposedly had in the economy. So it started to resemble stability, but they never really recovered.
That's right. And by the 4th century, you had government so deeply embedded in society and government spending and dependence upon government that any attempt to restore sound currency with that as a backdrop was bound to fail sooner or later anyway. For a gold standard or any kind of sound, stable currency to really perform its function and serve well, you've got to have a complementary fiscal policy. You've got to have balanced budgets. You've got to have restraint on spending. But that never happened. The Romans had become so addicted to government spending that even short-term attempts to say, well, we're going to have sound money now, really didn't go anywhere because sooner or later they just would depart from that and go on spending their merry way to bankruptcy.
I suppose we're giving the emperors themselves a bad rap, but in their defense, if you didn't spend huge amounts on particularly the military, you'd pretty much guarantee a military coup and just a knife in the back.
Well, they got both. they spent a fortune and they got knifed anyway. I mean, there's tremendous mortality among Roman emperors.
There's this famous quote from Emperor Severus to his sons. He said, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, scorn everyone else." Kind of sums up what the attitude was towards the later Roman Empire. That was you could almost think of it as a system where you have the military class, and they're doing pretty well. They get paid a whole bunch. They get free land. They get all these perks, and everyone else who they essentially just farm for as much as they're worth.
And Septimius Severus was just a delightful individual. But there was actually some of his predecessors tried to put Rome back on solid footing. Pertinax was one of the emperors before him, and he was very short lived. And he tried to raise the silver percentage in their coins, but it didn't last long before he was actually murdered, I believe, by one of his one of the other conspirators, and perhaps he didn't pay the army nearly as much, but Severus did have a fairly successful reign, even though he debased money like a wild man, and he did take care of the army. But the problem is, the army, it grew into a group of about 300 to 600,000 individuals, and they were placed all over Europe and in Africa and Asia, and there were different men that were commanding these different contingents. There was no way that you could make all of them happy and you could fund them as much as they wanted. And you see this, there was a lot of uprisings that happened in Roman Britain because they often were kind of forgotten. They were in an island far, far away. And they thought that they didn't get their share of the spoil. So you see a lot of uprisings coming from Britain because they thought that they were left out. So it was impossible, no matter how much money that they printed, it was impossible to make everybody happy.
Right, and they sort of backed themselves into a corner where it's, okay, we need to pay the common people, we need to give them free food, we have to pay the military, we have to give them gold and land. And when the real surprise is that it lasted for so long. I suppose it lasted as long as there were still neighboring states to conquer and plunder. Can you give thoughts as to why it lasted so long and why it eventually stopped?
Well, they had this really interesting system where they would go beat up their neighbor and they would say, would you like to join us? We'll share our money with you now that we've beat you up if you promise not to turn your back on us or to turn on us. And everybody said yes, and that's how they grew into what they were. And they came into contact with some of the larger tribes in Gaul and in Germany and also to the east. And they fought those wars predominantly under the Republic, and they conquered them. And that's when you see these areas in Gaul becoming Romanized. They consider themselves to be Romans. But beyond their borders, there were some Germanic tribes, and there were some, tribes over in the Far East. But most of them weren't unified. They were just these small individual groups that never really thought about forming any sort of federation. So it was easy for Rome to assert her dominance over these people. And in fact, periodically, they would just go into Germany and beat up on some German tribes to let them know that Rome was stronger and that they shouldn't consider invading them. But eventually, they got wise and they started teaming up with their neighbors, and they saw that they were much larger. And this caused many problems to where they could invade Rome and overpower their legions. And sometimes Rome won. So what they would do, instead of fighting a war, they would say, we will give you enormous amounts of land if you become our army instead. So they were able to avert disaster for a while that way. And these Germanic tribes actually, for the most part, they served Rome really well. But eventually, the barbarian horde from the north came into to Rome, and they couldn't repel them.
That was in 476, the year that historians typically say was the last year of the Western Roman Empire. Because of the taking of the city of Rome. But the mistake some people make is to look at that and say, that's why Rome fell. It was the barbarians that did it. But I think as we've recounted this evening on your program, Garrett, it's more fair, more accurate to say that Romans committed suicide, that they weakened themselves by allowing their character to deteriorate, by allowing the welfare warfare state to grow and to sap the strength and moral fiber of the people. And so when the city of Rome fell finally in 476, it was like a ripe plum in the hands of the barbarians. And many of the Roman people themselves welcomed the barbarians, thinking that anything would be better than the tyranny of their own tax collectors and their own emperors and their corruption.
Right, and I believe by 476, the population of the city of Rome was far below what it had been at its peak.
And it'll go far lower. At its low point in the, I believe, Middle Ages, it was down to under 20,000 people, whereas it was over 1 million some centuries before.
And I actually like to think about that sometimes. The Middle Ages, these 20,000 people living in the city that hosted more than 1 million people, hosted great games in these gargantuan buildings. And then there were these people in the Middle Ages just living there, living in the Colosseum, looking around at what this great civilization once did hundreds of years before them, and wondering how they were able to accomplish this. And I just find that amazing. And the answer is how do you prevent yourself, I believe, from losing your republic, from losing your liberties, and losing your rights? I think that's the question we should be asking.
It's almost like Planet of the Apes with the Statue of Liberty coming up out of the sand.
Garrett, I want to put in another word again for the page on our website where you'll find a lot of great stuff on Roman history, including pieces that Mark wrote, pieces that he and I co-authored, and pieces written by others. Anybody can go there and see it at fee.org/Rome.
And I'll also have a link to that on my show notes page for this episode, which will be economicsdetective.com/Rome. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Mark, for being on Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much.
If this is your first time listening to Economics Detective Radio, I implore you to subscribe. The show is available through iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcatching app. Special thanks goes to Austin and Elliot, my newest supporters on Patreon. Patreon is a service whereby you can sign up to give recurring payments to the creators who create the free content that you consume. If you want to donate just $1 or a few dollars per episode, that's a great encouragement for me that I'm doing something that people really appreciate. And when I decided to do this episode, I was feeling a little sick. I was thinking maybe I wouldn't do it. And then I got a new supporter on Patreon, and I thought, I've got to do it, and I've got to do it soon because people are counting on me. And I know that because they support me. So thank you to those people who support me already, and thank you to all of you who are listening.